I have been granted the role of the moderator, so I'm happy to start us off. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session, which will focus on the global governance of LEO satellite broadband. It is hosted by ISOC. We have strong ISOC representation. Many thanks to the Internet Society for hosting this session and for granting me the role of a moderator. We have excellent speakers today who will explain why it is worthwhile to look at low Earth orbit satellites right now in the context of regulating broadband and multi-stakeholderism and internet governance. So without further ado, I would start with the introductions of our speakers, hand them the floor, ask them a few scoping questions to let us understand why it is important to speak about internet governance in the context of satellites. Is this a hot topic that we should be debating now? Is this related to policy? And is there any work for the IGF to do? And then hopefully we will open the floor to questions. We want to use this session as a start of a conversation. We feel that there is a deficit on conversations about the role that satellites play in global internet connectivity, since the IGF is there to make sure that the next billion connects as quickly as they can, and that access is fair, equitable, and available to everyone. We will try to have that conversation today. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to start with brief introductions of our speakers. We will start with Dan York, who is leading a dedicated project on low Earth orbit satellites within the Internet Society. Dan is the director for online content within ISOC, well experienced in all Internet Society matters, and most recently focused on the dedicated project on low Earth orbit satellites. I don't want to reveal any surprises that you might have for us there, Dan, so I'm just going to stick to this very brief introduction, and I will let you share whatever you feel is appropriate at this point with our audience in due course. I will start with the introductions of all of our speakers, and then I'm going to hand the floor to Dan to give us a technical introduction about LEOs, what they are not, and why we might wish to care. Then I'm going to turn the floor over to Berna Akcali, who will be discussing the regulatory aspects of LEOs. Berna and myself, but just to give fair and due attribution, have been working on an Internet Society Foundation project dedicated to the policy aspects of LEOs. This work complements the work that Dan's group has been engaged in. And that's one of the reasons we thought it might be good to put our heads together and share with the IGF audience the work that has been done. I am going to turn the floor over to Berna, who is a professor with the university, the Queen Mary University in London, working on trade law, working on cybersecurity, internet governance, and Berna is going to give us a review of current European regulatory attempts as they stand with regards to low Earth orbit satellites. Then I'm going to turn the floor over to Mr. Michuki Mwangi, the second of our ISOC speakers here today on the agenda, who is today acting in his role as the Distinguished Technologist for Internet Growth at the Internet Society, focused on making sure that the way that Internet access grows is equitable and is fair, available to all. We particularly appreciate Michuki taking the time to join us here today, since the IGF is happening in Africa. Africa is the region where likely low Earth orbit satellites-based connectivity will be particularly important. So we're very much looking forward to your intervention, Michuki, trying to understand what might be the policy areas with regards to ensuring connectivity through low Earth orbit satellites. Then we will turn the floor over to Professor Larry Press of California State University, an expert on LEOs, with long track record of publications and public speaking engagements on low Earth orbit satellites. We have asked Larry today to speak about the North American perspective, if you will. Definitely the companies that offer this service commercially right now are based in North America. So we will try to see what they are up to and if there is anything for us as the IGF crowd to consider or be particularly aware of. We were also hoping to be joined today by Professor Wu Fei from the Jinan University from China. Very recently, we were informed that he might not be able to join us. I will be keeping my eye out for Wu Fei, maybe making his way to our virtual Zoom room. If that happens, I will be happy to give him the floor. So that is our plan. I am going to ask our speakers a very general question about what low Earth orbit satellites are for broadband connectivity, why we should care, and whether there is any recent activity that might make us care even more. What are the challenges? What are the things we should consider? Is there room for the IGF to discuss further policy? And what can an average IGF participant expect with regards to low Earth orbit satellites and internet connectivity? And with that lengthy introduction, I hand the floor over to Dan York to give us a technical intro. What are these things and why should we care, Dan? Please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna, and thank you everyone who's joining in from wherever you are in the world, all around, coming in by internet, and maybe some of you might even be coming in through a LEO system in some way. So I was asked to just talk about kind of what are LEOs and where do they fit in this, and I'm just going to start with the basic premise. With the Internet Society, we certainly think that the internet is for everyone, everywhere. And, you know, we have this question of how do we connect the unconnected? And for us, that's really the question on what can these low Earth orbit satellites or LEOs do? We've certainly seen plenty of press around this in so many different forms. And the interest really comes in a lot when we look at, we've had satellite internet access for decades from what are called geosynchronous or geostationary satellites. And they provide connectivity and they work. It's great in that regard, but it has long latency for the reason that they're so far out. They're 36,000 kilometers away from the Earth, and they're often a higher cost. LEOs have become quite interesting because of the fact that they can provide a low latency, high speed connection. So we can do things like have calls such as this, where we're coming in over a Zoom. We can be involved with gaming or virtual worlds or esports or any of these things with live streaming or others that we can't do. You know, a LEO satellite is a lot closer to the Earth, and so it has less latency. It's not as fast as a fiber connection, but I'll talk about speed in a moment. One note, since we're here in a policy space, when you look at policy documents and from the International Telecommunications Union or others, you will often hear the traditional satellites, the geostationary, referred to as GSO satellites, geosynchronous orbits and that kind of thing. And you'll see the other documents talk about an NGSO or non-GSO, which refers to the satellites that are in low Earth orbit, but also those which are in a medium Earth orbit. And let's just take a quick look at that. Generally, the definition of low Earth orbit is about, you know, from the Earth up to about 2,000 kilometers away from the surface of the planet. Now, most of the satellites that we have in these LEO constellations generally around 400 to 500 kilometers away from the Earth. Some are out at 700, there's some in 300, there's a wide range of different areas. It's a crowded space. That's where the International Space Station is, that's where other space stations is. It's a lot of that activity happening there. At the far end of this picture, in the red way out there, that's the geosynchronous orbit, which is 36,000 kilometers. It's a long way. So when we talk about latency, which is a word you'll hear a lot, the lag time, the delay, it takes about 600 milliseconds for a packet to get all the way out to the geosatellites and get back. A long time, and it's not something you can do necessarily in real-time communication like this. In the low Earth orbit, we're typically looking more at 40 or 50 milliseconds, a lot faster for a connection. Not as quick as cable or a fiber connection, which might be down around even 5 to 10 milliseconds, but it's fast. It's fast enough for the kind of connection that we're doing. But what happens with LEOs and where we get into some of these conversations is that you can't just put a couple of satellites up. With geosynchronous, you can have them, they're out at the edge of that 36,000 kilometer range, and they kind of orbit in time with the planet. And so you can just point your dish there and you get that kind of connection. With LEOs, they are in what are called constellations. They're in shells of many hundreds to thousands, tens of thousands, even one proposal for hundreds of thousands of satellites that are orbiting the Earth that are doing this. They're moving fast. They're in a different kind of form like that. These is what we're looking at and what we're talking about today. Part of the example that we see or part of the interest is why this is coming now. We've had advances in rocket technology where we're able to go and reuse rockets. We can reuse systems. We can launch a whole lot faster. We can mass produce satellites in ways that we just couldn't do in the past. We're seeing many, many examples. I'm not going to get into them here, but we've seen people in remote areas. We've seen communities, libraries, community networks, islands, disaster response. We're certainly seeing a lot of the usage of these systems in the Ukraine right now with their devastated infrastructure. Mobile systems, so many different ways that people are looking at using this. I want to just briefly touch on kind of the things we need to think about in the policy piece, the different parts of the system. You have the constellation, that's the most obvious one. The other piece is what's called in the industry the user terminal or the ground terminal. It's the antenna, right? It's the thing that you purchase from the company, you put at your house or your business or whatever, and that is connecting up to the satellites. Now, these satellites, these antennas are different from what you might have had in a traditional, if you look at a dish that you might have used for TV or something, those had a kind of a dish form, and you would point them at a satellite, and it was kind of how they were set there. These are what are called electronically steerable. They do their own identification of the satellites. They look more like pizza boxes or small flat boxes in some form. Those are the kind of things that are there. And in the third part of the equation is the ground station. These are the gateways, the sets of antennas that connect these constellations to the rest of the internet. To look at it graphically, this is what you see. You see a user terminal, somebody's thing, going and connecting up to one of these satellites and then connecting down to a ground station, which connects out to the rest of the internet. These pieces have to be there for this to work. Now, what's interesting is because these satellites move so quickly, your initial request for a web page or for whatever might go off of one satellite and the response might come back on a different one. This is how this all works, this constellation of these different things moving on. One of the interesting aspects that's happening with LEOs and why there's a lot of interest is, what if you're not near a ground station? What if you're in Antarctica or the northern polar regions or out in the middle of the jungle in some area of our world? What if there's no ground station near you? One of the advances that we've seen is something called intersatellite lasers, which is where you get into lasers in space and other different conversation topics around this. And this is the idea that your request could go to one satellite, which might send it to another satellite, to some number until it gets to a ground station that are there. The Internet Society just recently, a couple of weeks ago here, published a document which you can get if you go to internetsociety.org/LEOs, which is our paper, our document around offering our perspectives on this. There's a lot more information in there that I don't want to take time here to discuss, but I just point you to that. If you go to internetsociety.org/LEOs, you can see our paper and read our information. I will just touch on some of the concerns and the questions that we raised were some around affordability, capacity. Can these systems support all of the different things that we want to connect to them? What kind of competition happens in here? On the policy level, there's a whole lot of questions around spectrum allocation, interference of systems with each other, allocation of orbits, the approval process. Something people may not understand is that to bring one of these, to turn a system on in a given country, it has to be approved by the regulators in that country. So the vendors of these systems have to go around to every single country and get the approval in that kind of area. There's a range of technology questions, standards, all of those things, and there's a lot that we can't answer yet. There's things around, are all of these systems sustainable? Will they truly work? What are the environmental impact of all of these things? What's the impact on astronomy? There's many questions, which I know other colleagues here will be talking about as we get there. And so I want to leave you with that and just say, we're excited about this conversation. I think LEOs have a considerable potential to help us connect the rest of the world. But we really need to be asking these questions, talking about how do we do it in a way that is inclusive and really brings this to everyone. And I will turn it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dan. Well, to answer these questions, that's why we have a lawyer in the room. And with that, I'm going to swiftly turn the floor over to Berna, who one might expect will have all the regulatory answers, right? She could say, well, this is nothing new. We've had 5G, we had undersea cables, we've regulated the open sea, we have a treaty for outer space. Now, is it that simple? And with that, I turn the floor over to Berna Akcali for the regulatory background, with an emphasis on Europe. Europe prides itself on being a regulatory superpower. Have we got it all figured out? Berna, is that an easy question to answer? Thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you. May I have some help with the PowerPoints, though? I couldn't share on my screen. Okay.
I shall try to assist. You should be able to see.
Can you stop there? We can no longer hear you.
Okay. So can you hear me now?
Mr. Presenter.
Yeah. You can't hear me?
I do hear you.
Okay. Should I start or? Okay. So can we move to the second slide, please? Because okay. So thank you so much. Sorry for okay. So well, I was just thinking that it's so nice to follow someone who has already explained how LEOs work, because usually when we talk about this subject, you first have to explain in length what they are and how they work. And once we get to the legal side, there's not much time left. But yes,
no,
so
we
now
can't hear you.
Oh.
We can only read the chat or read the text.
Joanna, can you hear me though?
I'm hearing you.
Okay, I don't know what to do.
Yeah, we can hear you in the Zoom room, but I understand that there's no audio on the ground. There are two things we can do. We can keep trying, or we could try and switch to the next speaker and kindly ask Berna to see if you
on site. We can't hear you. Can't hear you. Can't hear you. Can't hear you.
I'm not sure. So if on site, are you able to hear anyone?
Can you hear me on site?
No, you are back.
Dear
No,
IT.
you are back.
Now we are back. So there was a glitch, I understand, with connectivity. Berna, would you kindly try and test your audio again? Yeah,
okay,
we're on the
I'll try again.
slide, so
no, I was just saying that I'm glad to be following someone who has already explained the technical background for this new technology. Well, and then did a fantastic job. So, but as legal scholars, the questions we are asked and the questions we think about are more along the lines of, are states and private companies allowed to deploy as many satellites as they like? Who's controlling all this? Which authority is responsible? And is there any regulation? Is there any international coordination? So in the first part of my presentation, I'll provide a brief, given the time limit, answers to these questions. And in the second part, I'll provide an overview of the response in the EU to the emergence of these new mega constellations. So can we move on to the third page, please? Okay, maybe I can. Okay, so the private enterprises undertaking these projects, such as SpaceX and Amazon Kuiper or OneWeb, are subject to a wide range of domestic laws and regulations, and in all phases of their operation. Most licensing and authorization procedures happen at the pre-launch phase, and rules and regulations about the in-orbit phase are primarily an extension of the oversight and control responsibility of the states. One example for this is the in-orbit tracking for purposes of traffic management to avoid collisions. The end-of-life procedures are also regulated at the domestic level. And I think it is safe to say that in most cases, more than one governmental agency is involved in regulating various aspects of the operation of satellite services. But of course, this all depends on which regulation, which jurisdiction they are operating in. Can we move to the fourth, please? Okay, so now, let's say that all these constellations have obtained all necessary licenses and authorizations, and they are in orbit, and they have global coverage. Can they provide services anywhere they like? The answer is yes and no. The provision of satellite services in a particular country is subject to that country's laws and regulations. These are called landing rights, and the countries decide for themselves the terms of these landing rights. For example, LEO broadband operators need to set up ground stations, and at least every 1,000 kilometers, I think, at the current stage of the technology, and they will need authorization to set up these ground stations. They will also need to obtain license to use the frequency spectrum, and if they are providing their services directly to consumers, they will also probably need to get an internet service provider license. So what's more, the importation of their user terminals will also be likely to be subject to import and export regulations. So it's not a straightforward matter. For example, Russia and China have already declared that they will not allow the provision of LEO broadband by foreign service providers based on national security grounds. So at some point, there will probably be some sort of harmonization, probably more on the regional level, but we'll see what the future brings. But if we want the LEO satellite constellations to fulfill their promise as to bridge the digital divide, these regulatory barriers need to be considered one by one, and they need to be discussed by all the relevant stakeholders at above domestic level. So can we move on to the fifth slide, please? Thank you. So there are all these rules and regulations imposed by national authorities, but do states have complete freedom for their regulatory practices? Do they have to comply with any international treaty when exercising their regulatory authority? And yes, the answer to that question is yes, they do. And the treaty obligations under outer space law and international telecommunications regulation are most relevant. So I'll try to, okay, thank you. So I'll start with outer space law. This branch of law governs all activities relating to outer space. Freedom of access, freedom of use, freedom of exploration, and state responsibility are the core principles underlying these treaties. The deployment of satellites over the years by an increasing number of states have been based on the understanding that orbits are free for use. And commercial enterprises and states rely on this principle for the LEO broadband constellation projects. But these treaties balance freedoms with obligations. So, for example, outer space, has been recognized as a province of all mankind as global commons. So no sovereignty claims may be made. And states cannot prevent or restrict others' peaceful space activities. States are also directly responsible for all their national space activities. It is their responsibility to make sure that all their activities are conducted in accordance with international law. So they have a strong incentive to supervise and regulate. States do have jurisdiction over the space object, and they are responsible to license and register the space activities and the objects. And registration is conducted by national registries, but this information is then made public through the public registry maintained by the UN. And these registries provide transparency, which act as a confidence-building measure among nations. And it's also necessary to prevent space collusions. In fact, it was the original purpose of the registry requirement. The state's responsibilities then expand to international liability. The launching state, which is not always the registering state, is liable for damage to other states, their citizens, and their property. Damage can occur on the ground, in the air, in space, and this is where insurance comes into play. And in respect of the high number of satellites planned for the constellations, there's an exponential increase in relevant risks. So the spacefaring nations and LEO satellite companies should be mindful of these responsibilities associated with the state and their liability regimes. There's a recent example in the US, FCC recently voted to require post-mission disposal of LEOs within 5 years. The previous recommendation was 25 years. And with this move, the US aims to increase its efforts to decrease the orbital debris, the risk of collisions, and the likelihood of space communication failures. If we move on to the next slide, I'll also briefly talk about the international telecommunications regulations. So these are of utmost importance to LEO satellites. Now, as Dan mentioned, satellites communicate with the Earth through radio waves. This is how their services reach the Earth. So for an interference-free service, they need an assigned radio frequency spectrum, which is a limited natural resource. They would also need to preserve the orbital slot or the orbital plane that they are located at, which is another limited natural resource. And the ITU has long been tasked with the coordination of the allocation of orbital space and also the spectrum among nations. So when LEO broadband satellite companies apply to domestic regulatory agencies, these regulators ensure that their rules and regulations comply with the rules and regulations of the ITU. And the states, not the companies, are responsible to do the necessary filing and registration procedures. And these registrations provide international recognition of the frequency assignment and the orbital positions used or intended to be used once it's recorded in the master register. This registration is important because it also gives a right to claim of protection from harmful interference. So over the years, compliance with these regulations have been high. The success is most likely due to physical necessity of a global coordination procedure for unobstructed use, more than the nation's altruistic view of complying with their international law obligations. Well, the ITU doesn't stop there. Its role is to also ensure that these resources are used rationally, efficiently, and economically, so that all nations have equitable access to both the orbits and the frequency spectrum. Now, until recently, these regulations regarding small satellites deployed to the low Earth orbit had been less burdensome. They didn't require coordination among nations. But as these new projects with large number of satellites emerged, the ITU saw a need to change its regulations. So in 2019, at the World Radio Conference, they decided to define what a constellation is. It was defined for the first time. And then they also established a requirement for a coordination procedure. It's a time-phased approach. Could we move on to the next slide? It's there. And this time-phased approach is designed to help ensure that the registration is aligned with the actual deployment of the non-GSO satellite systems. It's intended to establish the balance between prevention of spectrum warehousing and the proper functioning of coordination and notification and registration mechanisms. The ITU's expertise, years of expertise in management of spectrum and associated orbital resources was instrumental in taking these essential steps. I think this is a good start to achieve a fairer and more equitable system of allocation of the LEO resources and the associated frequencies. Now I'll talk a little bit about the EU's response to all of these developments. Could we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so what has been the response in the EU to these projects? Now, the EU does not have a constellation, and many of the EU states, in the slide you can see in the map of the EU, the light blue states have authorized the services of Starlink, and they are considering to also authorize and license other LEO broadband companies as well. So unlike China and Russia, they are open to allowing foreign enterprises to provide services within their borders. Of course, only if they comply with their rules and regulations. Now, this doesn't mean that the EU authorities are content with relying on non-EU companies for these services. Now, the critical role that Starlink broadband services played in Ukraine when the Russian forces disrupted their internet services was a key moment in the EU to understand the strategic role of this type of infrastructure. So recently, the European Commission, in its work program, announced that they will begin building a EU-based LEO broadband constellation. Well, it is proposed that the EU should have its own satellite communication network to ensure guaranteed access in an unrestricted manner by avoiding dependencies, and this is the keyword, the dependencies on third countries, in reinforcing the resilience of our value chain. It has also stated that it has also started including space sector in its documents regarding its strategic autonomy and cybersecurity concerns. Now, there are two new directives on the resilience of critical entities. Well, one is on the resilience of critical entities, and the other is on network and information security. And they have now, they are new, and they now include provisions that target the cybersecurity of the ground-based infrastructure of space-based services. Now, the new proposed directives are going to impact the space sector. Even though they do not apply throughout the whole space value chain, they apply to the operators of ground-based infrastructure, and as well as to public telecom service and network providers. So I think it is safe to say that the EU not only aims to harmonize the regulation of the use of LEO satellite broadband in a most efficient manner, but it would also like to see itself as a competitor in this emerging sector. Its motivation is not only economic, but also one that's motivated by strategic and security interests. So thank you, Joanna. This is my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Berna. I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now.
Thank you.
And I am going to turn the floor over to Michuki to see if any similar or complementary approaches might have been implemented anywhere in the African region. I do understand it's a broad space we're talking about, quite a diverse one, but the intervention from Berna clearly tells us that on one hand, there is a fundamental regulation in place that deals with the use of outer space, but at the same time, states, individual states and regions are noticing the potential policy issues that come with services like SpaceX and Starlink, but that's not the only company and that's not the only business model. We're not getting into the details there, but clearly there are policy issues to consider to make sure that the access of the next billion in developing countries is fair and equitable. And if any liabilities are to come up, there is insurance and there is a clear liability scheme to be applied. That is another tall order. I realize that, Michuki, that's a lot of questions, but just feel free to share the perspective that would be applicable to this IGF finding place in this specific region with regards to LEOs. What's the next step? What would we want our audience members to take away from this session? Thank you for being here, Michuki. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you, Berna, for that background and Dan. From an African perspective, and I just maybe want to provide some context here that from a connectivity perspective, if you look at reports and surveys and studies that have been done, looking at Hamilton research, it shows that around about 40% of the people in Africa will actually live further than 25 kilometers from a fiber optic node. And that means getting them connected with respect to connecting the unconnected will require, solutions that will need to extend this connectivity from that point to where they are. And that, based on the the current landscape, the costs of doing so using the backhaul that exists of terrestrial fiber or cable connectivity or wireless does become expensive, because if you're doing wireless, you will need to provide power in between the distances. If you're doing fiber, then you need the permits and all the other to sort of meet all the other costs, regulatory requirements and costs involved to be able to extend that connection. I normally call this point the edge of profitability, because that's where the commercial operators are able to get to. And anything beyond that will need complementary solutions or alternative business models to be able to get the people connected. So there are two issues here. There is, of course, the sustainability part of extending connectivity and the policy and regulatory aspects that need to come into play to help facilitate that connectivity. And LEOs present a unique approach because they're now looking at it from a perspective where they can come in from the sky, directly targeting the community that needs the connectivity, and provide an alternative that is not subject to the challenges or the limitations that the terrestrial connectivity is facing at present. That could also include the landscape and so on. And so the question is, I think, and going back to your question, Joanna, what are we seeing? There are a couple of challenges that are emerging and I think Berna has alluded to some of those. The first one, which is becoming more prevalent, is on data localization laws and regulation. By design, in terms of the way the satellites will work, it means that for those people who are connected, the packets will have to go out of the geographical, in some instances, if the ground station is outside of the country, by virtue of trying to scale this solution, they will need to be strategic in where they build the ground stations. So, for instance, if you look at East Africa, they'll probably not have a ground station in each country. They'll pick one location which will be more strategic to serve as the ground station for that region. So if a country in this region has a data localization law that states that the local user data traffic cannot be hosted outside the country, then it means that this presents a new challenge for the service to be taken up by users, because then the question is, where will the data that the users will have be hosted? And trying to bring it back, once it's already left, again, comes an additional cost, which could then have an extra cost to the users. So there are some consideration and discussions that will need to happen with respect to the data localization laws. I know some countries like Rwanda, for instance, has a data localization law, and so that will be something that will need to be evaluated. The other aspects that are quite connected to this is taxation. So one of the value that that LEOs provide is low cost. We've seen the terminal equipment coming in at a very low cost. I think we've seen up to $600 for SpaceX and others. But then the taxation that actually is applied in many countries across the region would actually then increase this price and make it go much higher than what most people will be able to afford. And that in itself then would sort of take away the initial benefits we are seeing with this technology in trying to connect the unconnected. So if the taxes go up, then it increasingly goes out of reach for many, and not just on the terminal equipment, but also on the service. And we've seen a number of countries in Africa, including taxes on connectivity. And this in itself, that means that if the LEOs operators will come into specific, to some countries where there is a data tax of some sort, then it means that that cost will also increase. So we've seen about $100 a meg, $100 a month for SpaceX. So if you add the local taxes, which could be about 15% on in some places, or 8%, I've seen some numbers between 8 and 15%, then that cost goes considerably higher. And that means that it's putting it beyond the reach of people who could actually benefit from that. Then, of course, there's the other challenge which comes with this with respect to being able to operate locally, the requirement of having local operations in terms of local service provider licenses in each of these markets. And that means they have to scale their operation. And as they scale and grow their operations, they hire their overheads, and they hire their overheads, the more expensive that the cost of providing that service becomes. So those are issues, policy issues, that will certainly need to be discussed at the local level and the national level. And, strategically, I think there will be an opportunity here for the regions, each region to see whether there is room to actually come together and jointly negotiate with these service providers and, give sort of like a unified approach to the service that they will be providing. Because if you look at the movements of the satellite, it might make sense in providing, a unified approach to the licensing and regulations across multiple countries, as opposed to each individual ones trying to have a different one cut out for each service provider. And that might simplify, lower costs, and basically make it more accessible to many people. The other thing that I wanted to point out in terms of the value we are seeing from the availability of LEOs is that their presence in Africa would certainly be helpful in not only bringing backhaul connectivity to remote and underserved areas for service providers to be able to extend their services there, but it also means that there is affordable backhaul as an option for other complementary access solution providers. And we've seen, as we've done some of the discussions around connecting the unconnected and providing like community network solutions to connect those in underserved areas, the biggest challenge has always been backhaul. And so if LEOs are a solution for that, then there are other policy considerations that need to be discussed at the national level, which is policymakers creating an enabling environment for these complementary access solution providers to actually exist so that they can take advantage of this technology and use it to connect those in underserved areas. So that's one area where more discussions need to happen, because at present there are only 3 countries that do have policy and regulation on complementary access solutions like community networks, actually 4. So you have Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, where you can actually look at the licensing and you can actually get a license for a community network. But for the rest of the region, this is an area that actually needs more work to be done. The other component that is important here is making sure that there is affordable broadband connectivity solutions for those in rural areas in terms of the service provision. So as Berna mentioned that, and I think also Dan pointed to this, that the business models that the LEO providers are coming up with is mostly to single subscriber models. And so in the discussions from a policy perspective, the question is, would this be the only business model that they need to come with, or they need to have a diversity of business solutions that would then make it possible to take advantage of or to leverage that solution for different use cases that may exist. When I say use cases, it means that if it's a single subscription model, then it means community networks may not be able to take advantage of the affordable backhaul that LEOs provide. Whereas if there's a diversity of options where they have a product for community networks or for an enterprise kind of connection, then it can actually have a distribution model. So those are things that will need to be considered in the licensing that will be provided to the LEOs operators to sort of cater for a broad-based subscription type, but also in the discussions to make sure that that is actually something that they are able to avail or provide to the markets that they're being licensed in. So I think those are sort of like the initial reactions that I would have based on that conversation, and happy to take on any comments and questions that participants may have. Thank you very much, Joanna. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michuki. To be quite honest, that are all the points that we were hoping you would raise. We have security, we have data, we have affordability, we have backhaul issues. So thank you very much for putting all of these on our agenda. I can see the questions coming up in the chat. We do have a dedicated Q&A section, so I will make sure that these are addressed. Thank you to our speakers for picking these up as we move on with the session. Just to wrap up what has been said thus far, this seems to be a relatively novel technological solution allowed for by the advancements of technology. The law is there, but there are countries and regions trying to adapt to these circumstances through local regulations. And then finally, Michuki very rightfully pointed out all of the policy questions that should be at the top of any national regulator's agenda when it comes to allowing LEOs into your jurisdiction. Data security, affordability, liability are the topics that are close to our hearts, having researched that topic previously. And with all of these introductory remarks, I would like to kindly ask Larry Press to take the floor. Larry, we're not seeing your camera there, but we have tested your audio and video, so that should work fine. Yeah, there you are. All right, brilliant. You might wish to unmute, and I am happy to share your slides for you if that would be useful.
I guess I can do it too. I see I have a sharing option here. Let me see if it works.
Brilliant. So please take us away. We are looking to answer questions about what has been done in the North American region. You have the leaders in technology. Are these issues being addressed? Should they? And how should we best solve this challenge? Thank you for being here, Larry. The floor is yours.
What I'm not seeing. Let me
I am glad to assist if useful. Just let me know.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going chair, but I don't see my PowerPoints.
Bring up.
No, that's weird. Oh, here.
See your desk.
Okay, can you see that? Do you see the PowerPoints now?
We can see your PowerPoint, not in full screen yet. That is probably the next step.
Right there. Okay, I get it. We got it working. Now I have to do this. How's that?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay. All right. Let me get going then. Let me put these out of the way so I can see it. Joanna asked a few questions. I picked two of them to give some answers to. One is, what role is going to be played by these LEO-based internet systems? And then I'll talk about that for a while, and then I'll switch to the potential benefits and challenges. So let's... Okay, here's a short run answer on that role. The short run answer is that it's important we're installing terrestrial internet fiber isn't possible. The kind of thing we just heard about in Africa and in rural and remote areas, to ships at sea, airplanes that are flying around, and so forth. And there's over here on this side, I've got a bar chart that just shows the percent of urban and rural people using the internet in 2021. And you can see that rural people, depending on region, is only as low as 13% and nowhere higher than 85%. So that's the short run answer. Now here's the long run answer. And this gets a little speculative. Joanna asked me to speculate, so here it goes. In the long run, I think we're going to have a multi-orbit, multi-layer internet, and I'll call that MOML because it's too many words to say. Here's a picture that kind of depicts that, and the components are shown on the left. They run from deep space to cislunar space. Cislunar space is between the Earth and the Moon, and then around the Moon. And then GEO and MEO, which we've heard about before, and LEO, to put it in context there. I think there's some companies trying to do, it's not clear whether they'll be a success, trying to do narrowband communications in low Earth orbit as well. HAP stands for high altitude platforms. That's things like balloons and dirigibles. They don't exist yet, but there still are people that think that may be a possibility. And then for sure, airplanes that are flying, and then obviously the terrestrial land and sea network. So this is, I would envision the possibility that this maybe 10 years from now, 15 years from now, will be an integrated network. So where are we today with this NOML connectivity? There are data relay services using LEO and GEO satellites. Like a LEO satellite will gather some, say, Earth observation data, send it up to a geostationary satellite, which will then broadcast it back, send it back to Earth. Several vendors have developed and demonstrated MOML terminals and antennas. That's, you can see in the picture over here, that kind of illustrates that. Two companies that are doing low Earth orbit satellites, Telesat and EUTEL, I'm not sure how you even pronounce it, EUTEL Sat and OneWeb, which I think are merged now. They both operate geostationary satellites today, and of course they're building out LEO constellations. OneWeb and SpaceX have demonstrated low Earth orbit to aircraft integration already, and SpaceX Starlink is already marketing consumer and maritime connectivity. The previous speaker said that everybody's focused on consumer. To date, that's been the primary emphasis of SpaceX, which is the only company that's got anything going now. But both SpaceX and all the others are going to branch out and cover other markets as well. Okay, here's speculation on how I see that on that network. I've talked about that it's going to be perhaps this MOML network. And what I'm going to talk about here is a project that I think may be giving us a look at the start of that, the project that may lead to it. And here it is. It's a lot of words there. It's the Hybrid Space Architecture Project of the United States Defense Innovation Unit. So HSA and DIU. These may lead to that MOML integration that I spoke of earlier. And let me just tell you a little bit about them. The DIU has eight HSA demonstration contracts so far. The first one, and kind of the most important, is to a company called Illyria Space, and they have an operating system for this kind of a network called Spacetime. And you can see over here just a screenshot from Spacetime. And that is what, if my conjecture turns out to be true, will keep all this together. Two other contracts have been led to Amazon and Microsoft, and that's for supplying their cloud computing services, storage services, as well as ground station services, which they offer. There's another company, Project Kuiper, has gotten one of these contracts. It's owned by Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, and their thing they're trying to demonstrate is service to underserved users, like we're talking about here. And then there are 5 other contracts that are military related for battlefield status, security, and privacy. The bottom line is these companies have been tasked to demonstrate what they can do in 2 years. And a couple little notes I kind of put down there at the bottom. One is that SpaceX, which is the kind of big elephant in the room here, is missing from this list. I don't know, but I suspect that may be because SpaceX is committed already, so much committed to what they're doing that perhaps they wouldn't be willing to fit into this space-time architecture. Microsoft and Amazon appear to both be competing, but my guess is that if this comes true, they will both be participating in the final solution. I guarantee you that. Like I say, Illyria integrates it all. And the final thing is that this DIU and HAS, they're totally reminiscent of the start of the internet or the pre-internet, which was very much done by the Department of Defense, ARPA, Advanced Research and Research Projects Agency, and of course the ARPANET, which preceded the internet. So we may be seeing a replay of that. Okay, that's what I have to say about kind of where it all fits. And now the second thing that Joanna asked was to talk about potential benefits and challenges of LEO-based internet access. And I think the benefits are well known. So I'm going to look at 4 challenges. And I've listed them here in order of increasing difficulty. So let me start. First one, which was just and obviously mentioned for Africa, affordability. The tweet here on the left was a year or 2 ago by Elon Musk, the head of SpaceX. And you can see he's saying it's meant to be the same price in all countries. And at the time that struck me as crazy. And I wrote something about it because it seems that just can't be. Market forces Oops, how do I get this out of the way? Oops, there we go. Market forces have led to affordable pricing. And the reason is these satellite constellations, they represent a very large investment and fixed cost. The marginal cost of adding a new user is quite low if the capacity exists. And at the US price, demand would be very low in poor countries or say on an island. Therefore, operating at full capacity requires affordable prices. And that's in fact what has happened. SpaceX now has regardless of what Elon said at the start, SpaceX has adopted variable pricing and also different service level guarantees, for example, for the kinds of enterprises that were mentioned before. And that will help, that will allow them to do their best to utilize available capacity. And the thing about that is that capacity is a really dynamic thing. SpaceX capacity today is not going to be their capacity tomorrow. So I think we see probably prices jumping around. Some of the things that make lead to changes in capacity. One is adding satellites. As they add more satellites, capacity goes up. As was mentioned before, there's regulations regarding replacement of these things. And the US, I think now they're asking for a 5-year replacement cycle. And a lot of technology changes take place within 5 years. And for example, SpaceX, their version 2 satellites are already being manufactured, and they have nearly 10 times the capacity of the current satellites. SpaceX, Dan talked about inter-satellite links. SpaceX has them now. I think certainly SpaceX is going to deploy all of them. And I think all the other vendors will too. And that in itself adds capacity. And finally, the radio frequency ground stations that Dan mentioned, they're adding them all the time and they are getting better. Same thing with, this technology improvement. And I think I'd be surprised if in the future we don't see optical ground stations that don't use radio waves, but use light. They have several advantages. Two main ones. They're much faster transmission rates, and they don't need the kinds of regulation from regulators to install them. Okay, here's moving up to something more difficult. Is dealing with the problems of political interference and social division, which I think are well known to all of us. I picked just 2 examples here. The one on the left is a wanted poster. Those 11 guys are Russian hackers who are wanted by the FBI or the United States for interfering with our election in 2016. And the one on the right is a sad one. It's well known. I've got references in the notes to these slides to the fact that Facebook hate speech has promoted Facebook has promoted violence against the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. Just backing up on that, in 2011, only 1% of the population in Myanmar had internet access. In 2013, the government let contracts to 2 competing mobile companies to come into the country. And by 2016, almost you can see in the chart here, the left-hand part is Myanmar. Almost 90% of the people were online. So once Facebook was able to be seen by people, it had kind of a disastrous effect. The reason I think this is maybe it's certainly a harder problem than affordability, which I think the market takes takes care of. But I think that a partial solution to this is critical thinking education. And for this, I did some original research for this presentation. I asked 2 of my grandchildren whether when they're in school, whether they were kind of given lectures or if they talked about fake news and critical thinking, that sort of thing. And I'm kind of happy to report that both of them said yes. One of them is a junior in college now, and the other one is still in high school. And it's interesting, she was even more positive. She's positive that the unit that they got and the stuff that's been brought up in their classes, that it's really worked, that all students that in her school would be very sensitive to these problems. So that's slightly good news. Getting harder, I think it was mentioned earlier that with the necessity to regulate the satellite licenses is the problem of debris in low Earth orbit. What I'm showing here is this is from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. They have this database on low Earth orbit. And as of May 21st, that was the date this was done, they say there were 4,700 satellites in low Earth orbit. And a couple of the breakdowns. Over here on the left, we see that the big majority of those are commercial. And of course, commercial companies, they worry about profit and therefore kind of do need to be regulated sometimes. Looking at the applications, the preponderance are in communication, but that is more than just the low Earth orbit broadband that we've been talking about. It's other forms of communication. There's a big chunk of them doing Earth observation, and those things are absolutely critical in the climate problems that the Earth is going. Without them, we would be in dire straits. We're in dire straits with them. Anyhow, you can see that there are a lot of other satellites that aren't doing broadband internet. But then if you look at the thing over here on the right, these are the companies that are committed now and working on putting up broadband constellations. And look at it, this isn't what's approved, but they have applied for 59,000 satellites. So you can see things are going to get kind of crowded. And obviously more satellites increase the probability of collisions, which generate debris, and those debris then cause more probability of collisions. So there's a thing called, it can get out of hand. Tracking and mitigation is a difficult technical and political problem, and it requires international collaboration. And that's why I say this is a difficult one. And then speaking of international collaboration, we're going in the other direction. This slide is just talking about China versus the US, both economically and politically. And I've got a couple examples of China policies, a couple examples of US policies. This diagram or map is actually, it's a year or so old, but it shows what the Chinese call their Digital Silk Road project, in which they're investing in digital infrastructure all around the world. And of course, the US down here, and Joe Biden as well, is very much worried about China cutting off supplies and becoming independent. So this is a tough problem, which I will leave on that. Okay, the slides that you've just seen, they're kind of giving you just a really quick overview. Tried to keep it brief for the thing. The slides themselves have a lot of, in the notes part, there are references and links that elaborate on a lot of what I've said. And if you send me an email, I'll send you a copy of the slides. And that's about all I have to say.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Larry. That is very comprehensive. Again, ticking all the boxes that we might have wished to be put on a table for this discussion, particularly the developing countries angle with the Chinese Silk Road, with the economic war, if you will, that is unfolding before our eyes. Berna mentioned the plans that Europe has for also possibly spreading investments in developing countries. So with that, what I would like to do is I would like to take us into the Q&A session. We are doing relatively good on time. We do have all of our speakers participating remotely, but Isaac has been wonderful in facilitating a person on the ground, that is Mark Carvel, who's acting on behalf of ISOC on the ground in Addis Ababa. And what I would like to do is I would like to kindly ask Mark to see if there might be any questions or comments in the room, on the ground, in a region that is hopefully particularly interested in these policy topics. So we will start the Q&A session with Mark, if possible, reaching out to our audience in the room. And I know that we are relatively well attended on the ground. If there are questions or comments in the room, Mark, if you could facilitate, that would be wonderful. And we will then move to the questions that I have diligently collected in a little notebook file. And I will read those out, giving our panelists a chance to respond. I do note the answers in the chat happening as we speak, but I am going to give our participants an opportunity to hear those questions discussed by the panelists as well. Before I do, however, Mark, if you are able to facilitate any questions or comments from our on-the-ground participants, that would be wonderful.
Okay, Joanna, I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
We can hear you well. Thank you very much for being here. Please go ahead.
If there's one lesson from the IGF here, it's always to test the audio and find out if you can be heard. Okay, we do have, I've seen 3 hands go up for questions, comments and feedback. So I'll take them in order. Gentleman on the right, and if you'd like to introduce yourself and then go ahead with your question or comment, it'd be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson of the room, and let me thank the presenters of this topic of the satellite. My name is Honorable Reatile, a Member of Parliament from Botswana. The question that I would like to pose here, as you know that once you're a politician, we have to make sure that the deliverables are achievable. So right now, I would like to understand the issue of when you are talking about to put up the satellite, the cost associated with developing the satellite. And again, the capacity of the satellite, because right now we have rolled out the fiber. The fiber has been rolled almost 2,000 kilometers within the country, but is there on the ground, but the people are not using it because they are not connected. How satellite is more doable than the optic fiber? And again, maybe to expand on my question, hypothetically, let's say we talk about a population of 200 million. How many satellite can we put up to make sure that it's going to service that kind of population? The ground station, what happens if the said country doesn't have a ground station to collect the information from the satellite? I submit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Joanna, there are, I think, 3 questions there. Much appreciated. Do you want to take first stab at answering or ask somebody from the panel of speakers? Thanks.
It might be useful for us to collect the questions, if that's okay with Dan. I see him raising his hand to answer that one, but it might indeed be recommendable for us to collect the 3 questions, if that's just 3 questions, and we will then turn the floor to our speakers, if that's okay. Thank you very much, Mark, for facilitating.
Okay, so I'll take the other questions now then. Yep. Okay. So yeah, second question I saw go up. Yep, thank you.
Yes, my name is Hossein Mirzapur from Iran, for the record. Actually, I think I'm the youngest commissioner of Iran so far. So first of all, thank you for this nice discussion. I think it was a unique opportunity to see two different perspectives on two sides of Atlantic Ocean. One was more innovation friendly, and the other was concerned with regulatory issues, etc. And it was really insightful. My question is that as far as we have seen in the other online platforms like social media, etc., the US version of innovation is more advanced normally. Because, you know, let me just back to one important phrase was mentioned that Europe has recently pivoted to a European constellation, right? So the big question is, if Europe cannot catch up the US internet satellite providers, and we reach one day that all European citizens, they have a more affordable version of US internet. They can use it with less price and more easily. So what are the options in front of Europe to keep those satellite internet providers responsible to its regulatory system? Because we know very well, as far as US companies are advanced in terms of innovation, Europe is advanced in terms of the regulation framework, etc. So what is our estimation of the future of this debate? Thank you.
Thank you very much. A very interesting question. A lot of sort of geopolitics there, as well as orbital issues. I think there was one question. Is it Roberto? Do you want to put a question? And then we'll go back to the speakers for responses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam and Joanna, for the moderation as well. I would like to ask about two questions. One related to price expectations, because in all satellite services, well, the current satellite services that we use for telecommunications is regarding, I mean, the problems regarding with the cost and also with the capacity. I mean, the speed that we can get for internet services, which is really low for the current services. I think we may be solving one of these issues with low Earth, which is the price, the capacity. The speeds will be better, but the other problem, I think it's going to continue to be a problem in the future. Is there any expectation about how the service will be regarding how affordable it can actually be for the people's, I mean, for the population that will be using it in the future, particularly in the rural areas where they don't have any other option? And the second question is regarding the recommendations for the frequency, the spectrum assignment, because some countries, and I can include mine, have in their national spectrum plans particular allocations for particular applications, and of course, it would prevent us to actually access to this kind of services. Is there a way, maybe going through the organizations like ITU, that could get some particular recommendations or strategies that actually are distributed, are discussed with all the countries in order to actually allocate this spectrum for particular applications in low orbit satellites? Those are my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. So back to you, Joanna and Dan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. Indeed, Dan, please start us off, and we will hand the floor over to further speakers as we progress. Dan, thank you.
Great. No, those are some great questions that are there. Let me see if I can hit some of these that were here. For the gentleman in Botswana, if I had that correct, there, you know, if you're already deploying fiber is going to be a faster, you know, you can have lower latencies, higher capacity in fiber than you will out of any wireless system. It just will. So if you can get fiber to people, then that will give you the lowest latency, highest speed connections you're probably likely to get. So I wouldn't stop investing in fiber. I think that's a good thing to keep getting it out there and putting it out there. But the satellite technologies, in particular LEO, can provide great connections for people who don't have access to that. Michuki mentioned how many people are, they're within 25 kilometers. They're too far away from a fiber endpoint to be able to connect to. So I think that that LEOs provide an excellent solution in that kind of space. I think your other questions around, launching, it kind of leads into the question from the second gentleman as well, I think, around who owns these systems, right? Does the country of Botswana need to launch its own system? Probably not, but who does control it? Right now, the major systems that are going online are, in the case of SpaceX, it's a US company. OneWeb, which is the other system that has up there, I've actually lost track of its ownership right now at this precise moment, but I know it was owned by the UK and an entity in the Middle East, and then it was being bought by Eutelsat. So I don't actually know where it sits at that moment, but it's a consortium of different entities in different places around that kind of thing. And then the other major players, two of the other ones that I know of, Amazon with its Project Kuiper is planning to launch in early 2023, again, a US entity. And then the Telesat is an entity out of Canada. So another place there. And then there is another constellation coming, well, the EU just mentioned wanting to put one together there. There's actually about 16 of these large scale constellations that are in the process of going through various different levels of approvals. Some of them are from other North American or European entities. Some of them are from, there's a filing with the ITU for a company based out of Rwanda. There's another out of India. There's a couple out of China. We don't know how many of those are actually going to lift off and launch. As Berna mentioned, there's a timeline that has to happen, that you have to, when you get the allocations, you have to meet certain deployment guidelines. You have to have 50% of yours up and then 100% within certain timeframes, or else you lose the spectrum allocations from the ITU and the pieces like that. So there's an incentive to do that. I don't know that every country will need, pieces, but many countries or many groups will try to launch over this next period of time. It's expensive, even with the costs that are reduced that we've talked about to launch those systems. So I think many more countries will be consumers of these other systems. And so that raises the question of the second gentleman spoke about, which is, how do you, this whole question around whose connections are you connecting to? Are you only connecting to internet access that is offered by US-based corporations? What does that mean? What for regulations, for regulatory reform? These are all questions that need to be addressed by groups, multi-stakeholder groups such as the IGF and places around this, to think about what are these policy issues. In our paper that the Internet Society wrote, we highlighted that several of these are exactly these kind of questions are out there. One last thing for the person around from Botswana, you mentioned about, do you need to have ground stations? I think Michuki mentioned, or Berna mentioned, it's within about 900 to 1,000 kilometers, that there needs to be repeated ground stations. But that doesn't necessarily mean there needs to be one in every country. And what it will need to be, though, is that certain countries will need to be arranging landing rights. There's terminology in here. They'll need to arrange ground station access in somewhere else. I would expect, as Michuki mentioned, we'll probably see regional ground stations for some parts of things. So that would be it. I will answer the one last piece and then I'll turn over to my other speakers. The third gentleman spoke about spectrum and spectrum assignment. Berna can probably give us much more detail, but I will say that you're not alone. The ITU has established various different spectrum allocations, and specifically ones for countries, for satellites, excuse me. And these are the ones that then the countries are going around and getting confirmation of that in there. I spoke at the Armenian Internet Governance Forum a couple of weeks ago, and their regulator was on the panel with me, and he said exactly what you're speaking about there, that in their country, the normal frequencies that are being used for SpaceX in particular, for LEO satellites, are already in use by their military and national security and other elements like that. And so for SpaceX to be operating in their country, there's collision there. It's a shared spectrum, but can they both interoperate? Or do they have to look at how do they move their military systems to some other frequencies to be able to work with that? There's a whole host of questions in there and lots of things, but ultimately it has been the ITU and the regulators out of that who have done that spectrum allocation. But I would probably defer to Berna to talk a bit more about that particular question. I'll leave it to my other panelists now, Joanna.
Yes, Berna, please go ahead. That question had your name written all over it. Please go ahead.
So I'll start with the question regarding the EU. Joanna and I are working on a paper, and in this paper we talk about equitable access to space resources and spectrum resources. And in that paper, we mentioned that it's not desirable to have one nation, one constellation in space. The constellations that are already planned should be more than enough to respond to the global need at this point. So I don't think the question should be whether the nations should really have their own constellation, but the question should be how do we use these existing constellations, existing infrastructure in a manner that would be acceptable to everyone. So when we consider the EU's perspective on the issue, the EU's primary concern is not to have its solitary internet network. EU's understanding of digital sovereignty is not a closed-off network for the EU from the rest of the world, but rather its sovereignty understanding relies on mitigating dependencies on non-EU infrastructure. So the EU states have authorized some of these non-EU enterprises, and it's all fine. The EU is not concerned with authorizing these enterprises, but EU is more concerned about relying solely on these enterprises alone. It would like to have a backup system where it could fall back to. So, and also, of course, economic competition, strategic concerns play a role in this. But as I said, the EU is still figuring out how to impose its cybersecurity regulations, data protection regulations in relation to these emerging business models. And business model is also not a single business model. There's a Starlink model that you have where the company reaches to the consumers directly, and then you have the alternative OneWeb model where the company prefers to work with the incumbent telecom operators. So in that sense, the policy changes, the regulations changes, the requirements and the licenses, they all change. And I think the EU is confident, although it's still figuring out, that it could impose its existing regulations to these emerging business enterprises. So I think the understanding of sovereign internet or digital sovereignty is quite different when compared to some more authoritarian state approaches. So that's my answer to the question related to the EU. And as for spectrum allocation, the ITU is considered the oldest international organization. So the states, the nations have I think maybe if you compare with all other international organizations, states have more expertise in negotiating within the EU. You have a different dynamic within the EU compared with all other international organizations, and it's a very successful forum for supporting developing nations. So I think it is an appropriate forum and it's a multi-stakeholder forum as well. I mean, in other international organizations, we don't have private enterprises, you do not have non-governmental organizations, but at the ITU you have them as members. So I think it is the correct organization to discuss all spectrum-related issues, and it has been, it has been criticized for being slow. But I think it is still the correct forum to address spectrum-related issues of developing nations. So I hope that answers your questions, but if it doesn't, I'm willing to elaborate further.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Berna. I do note we are just out of time. I will try to wrap us up in the next few minutes. Many thanks to our supporting staff for bearing with us for 2 more minutes for me to wrap things up. This is by far not an exhaustive recap of the topic. This is merely an introduction to a discussion. What I'm going to do is I'm going to leave you with a link to the ISOC report that Dan has mentioned on a number of occasions. Do consider that an introduction to the topic. We are thrilled to be able to share our thoughts with you here today during this this workshop. Thank you very much for your feedback. Thank you also to Shiva for the extensive conversation here in the chat, and thank you to our panelists for insightful and comprehensive interventions. This session will be recorded. Our speakers are available should you wish to reach out to them directly. Please feel free to do so. Thank you for accompanying us throughout this workshop and listening to the concerns. Thank you for accommodating a topic that might feel very technical, very complex, or on the other hand, already fully regulated because we have legal provisions on all of these things. But as we have learned, that is by far not the case. So I will try to wrap us up here very quickly. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to our hosts. Thank you to our audience. I understand this is quite late where you are, and this is not an easy topic. So thank you very much for your active participation. I will try to conclude here right now. We are leaving you with a recording and a report, and hopefully looking forward to seeing you soon talking about affordability, connectivity, and fast internet. Thank you for being here. Have a good day for Larry, being there very early in the morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you may be. Thank you very much. The session is concluded.